All right, in this video, we're going to be looking at this concept of speciation. And so what is speciation? Well, speciation is when a new species is created. And why might a new species be created? Well, a new species is created typically when two populations have become reproductively isolated. Um, what does that even mean? So you have some sort of ancestral finch in this picture that represents a single population of finch. Well, let's say that something causes them to be isolated from one another. We're going to talk about some of those causes in this video, so that you have one group doing one thing and another group doing another thing. Well, eventually they're going to become two different species because they're no longer reproducing with one another. They're going to have independent evolutionary changes. They're going to experience the environment differently because of those independent adaptations, and that's going to lead to further change, and they're just no longer going to be reproducing with one another, we need to define what is a species. A species is a group of organisms that are capable of interbreeding to produce fertile offspring. So why do I have a picture of a mule? Well, a mule is not a species. It is a hybrid between donkeys and horses. It's not a species because two mules cannot make another mule. They are not fertile. And so a donkey and a horse are isolated from one another because they cannot produce fertile offspring. Doesn't mean that they don't occasionally have a baby. It just means that that baby is not fertile. And so that means that they are isolated from one another. There are several mechanisms which can cause this kind of reproductive isolation, which can in turn cause speciation. So we're going to go through this list of reproductive isolation. Some sort of biological barrier that is preventing them from interbreeding, or if they are breeding, it's preventing them from having fertile offspring. These are going to take one of two forms. They're either going to be a prezygotic barrier. So prezygote, meaning the zygote, which is the combination of the sperm and the egg through the process of fertilization, that is not being created. Or they're going to be post-zygotic barriers in which the zygote has been created, but there's some other barrier that is reproductively isolating those two populations. So here's a picture of that just to give you the idea. Prezygotic, prezygote, sperm and egg never meet up. Postzygotic, sperm and egg have met up to make a zygote, but something has kept them from making a fertile offspring. Just looking at that weird picture. Anyway, so let's talk about some prezygotic barriers. One is habitat isolation. This is when species live in different habitats. They rarely come in contact with each other. One lives in the grass, the other lives in trees. Some sort of adaptation has occurred to allow them to do better in the trees than in the grass. They're going to just never come in contact. Temporal isolation. This has to do with time. It could have to do with the time of day. It could have to do with the time of year. But something is causing them to be isolated from each other temporally, and they're not reproducing. Some frogs start calling in early spring. Some frogs don't call until the summer. They are isolated from one another. They have a different isolation uh, because of their time, which leads me to the next one, behavioral isolation. Um, some frogs sound one way, some frogs sound another. This is a mating call. This is a behavior that, so you can sum them all up by calling them courtship behaviors. Birds are another great example of this. They have a particular courtship behaviors, so they um, aren't mating because they don't recognize one another's song. In other words, mechanical isolation. This is where there's just some structural differences or structural incompatibilities that prevent two organisms from reproducing successfully. And the last one is gametic isolation. This is where the sperm and the egg literally just chemically can't combine, preventing the production of a zygote, which is going to isolate these two individuals. Some postzygotic barriers are these three here. So in each of these, again, the zygote has been created, but there's something that is preventing them from being a productive species. And I should have chosen a more blurry picture. I hate to give you a picture this clear. So first one is called hybrid inviability. Basically, the idea is that the zygote is not viable or the organism is not able to complete its development and so is not able to grow into a reproducing adult. There's hybrid sterility, which is the example of the mule that I gave you earlier. The hybrid is a viable offspring, but is not able to reproduce successfully because they are infertile. And the last one is called hybrid breakdown, which the first generation hybrids are fertile and are able to reproduce, but the second generations are not. And so basically, the fertility of the hybrid breaks down over time and is a barrier to those populations. There are different kinds of speciation that occur. There's allopatric speciation, which is essentially the one that we've been talking about. This typically has to do with geographic isolation, where there's some sort of boundary that has occurred that is preventing um, those two species on either side of that boundary to reproduce anymore, like the production of a mountain range. Obviously, this is going to be a slow process. The Grand Canyon is a good example. You have one species of squirrel on one side of the canyon and another species of squirrel on the other side of the canyon. Uh, Whenever the Grand Canyon formed, before it formed, that species of squirrel was likely one species. That's allopatric. Allopatric basically means different land. And so then sympatric, same land, is where there is speciation occurring that is in the same area. Refers to, due to some sort of other reproductive isolation. There's not a geographic isolation. Could be a mutation, could be polyploidy, like we've talked about. There could be some other habitat isolation, sexual selection. Something is causing there to be a speciation event to occur. And then the last thing to look at here is just the rate at which this occurs. There are two prevailing models in this, and one of them is called punctuated equilibrium, and the other is gradualism. So gradualism on the left is evolution occurs very slowly and gradually. All ecological conditions change slowly, so therefore the creatures that live in those ecosystems also change slowly. This works to an extent. One that is more commonly accepted is called punctuated equilibrium, which equilibrium means a long periods of no change, kind of like what we're experiencing now on the Earth, right? A long period of no change, then punctuated by a short period of rapid change. So 65 million years ago, the Chicxulub asteroid hits the Earth and causes a short period of rapid change, lots of extinction, and lots of change following that extinction. How does that change happen following that extinction? Well, this is something called adaptive radiation. Sometimes you'll see this called divergent evolution, which remember, convergent evolution is where everything is having the same sorts of traits. Well, divergent will be the opposite, right? You have one thing, but everything is going to exhibit different traits coming out from that single common ancestor. And so, how would this occur? Well, speciation rates can rapidly occur after a big event like the Chicxulub crater, for instance, which would cause there to be a lots of available niches. When all the dinosaurs went extinct, there were a lot of available niches, and so mammals rose up to meet the challenge. There was a quick time of lots and lots of change, and quick geologically is several 100,000 years, and so this is called adaptive radiation in that there's adaptation, right? There's adaptation or change that's radiating out from a single source, single common ancestor, filling those niches and those roles in the ecosystems in order to get those resources to become reproductively successful. That's the whole idea here behind all evolutionary change is that. And so ultimately, all evolutionary change is some kind of version of this, or just a gradual change over time.